Big day down here in D.C. Vindication is the order of the hour at the White House as the Supreme Court upholds the president's signature piece of legislation and changes the lives of 33 million Americans in the process. For the young, the poor, the sick, and even the well, the Affordable Care Act is no longer a question, but indeed, quite possibly, the answer. It's Thursday, June 28th, and this is Now. Joining me today, MSNBC political analyst David Corn of Mother Jones, MSNBC political analyst and former RNC chair, the notorious Michael Steele, former Clinton White House chief of staff, John Podesta, and Jody Cantor of the New York Times. We are expecting to hear from President Obama in just a few moments on this momentous day for his administration and, of course, the country. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act, validating the president's most important domestic achievement. But Republicans are not giving in on their vow to fight the law. House Majority Leader Eric Cantor's office has scheduled a vote for a full repeal on July 11th. And just a short time ago, Mitt Romney spoke in Washington.
I disagree with the Supreme Court's decision, and I agree with the dissent. What the court did not do on its last day in session, I will do on my first day if elected president of the United States. And that is, I will act to repeal Obamacare.
Joining us now from New York is NBC's chief legal correspondent, Savannah Guthrie. And out on the West Coast, host of MSNBC's The Last Word, Lawrence O'Donnell. Great to have both of you guys with us today. Savannah, I want to go to you first in terms of what exactly is in this ruling. We know there are two sort of big pieces that measurably change the Affordable Care Act. One is the mandate and the fact that it is not being considered a penalty, but, of course, a tax. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this was somewhat of a surprise, I think. You know, all of the oral arguments seem to center around whether or not the individual mandate, the requirement that every American purchase some minimum level of insurance, whether or not that was a valid exercise of the federal government's power under the Commerce Clause. But the government did have a backup argument, and that was, look, this mandate and the penalty that's attached to it operates as a tax. We don't call it a tax, but it's in the tax code. It operates as a tax. And it's on that Chief Justice Roberts, and he was the ball game here, the whole ball game, determined that, yes, it was a valid exercise of the government's power, the federal government's power, if you looked at it under the tax clause. It's a fascinating read. It's a very fractured court because while the Chief Justice did side with the liberals in the ultimate result, their reasoning to get there was different in almost every case. And frankly, I'm looking at it and still trying to figure out where each justice came down on it. But the bottom line was they upheld that mandate. The second piece of it has to do with the Medicaid expansion. This was one of the huge innovations inside the health care reform law. It's one of the reasons why coverage was expanded to so many in theory, because Medicaid was expanded and the states were going to have to pay for some of it. Some of the states sued. And what the court found today was, you know, if these states were forced to either accept this Medicaid funding and start also helping to fund more patients. If they didn't do it, they would lose all their Medicaid funding altogether. And Chief Justice Roberts said if we went with that scheme, that would be unconstitutional. But he said as long as you give states the choice, this portion of the law can survive. I think the practical effect, Alex, is that it may undercut quite a bit of what the health care reform law was trying to do with regard to Medicaid, but it still has been upheld and not struck down as unconstitutional.
NBC's Savannah Guthrie, thank you, my friend, as always, for your time. We know you have a busy day today, and we appreciate taking a little bit of time for us.
You got it. Sorry for the long answer.
No, they were great answers. Lawrence, we've talked a lot about the president and his selling of this law. It is one of the best things to come out of this whole process has been, I think, more transparency with regards to what is actually in the Affordable Care Act. What is in effect now, of course, is that 3.1 million young adults have gained insurance because they can be on their parents' health insurance up until the age of 26. Children with pre-existing conditions can't be denied coverage. The preventative care pieces. There are 12 million people in this country that are getting rebate checks from their insurance companies. We now know that the stuff that is that was slated to take place in 2014 will, in fact, take place in 2014. The biggest piece of that, of course, is that adults with pre-existing conditions cannot be denied coverage. That's going to affect 36 million million to 112 Americans with pre-existing conditions. The president is going to be speaking in a few minutes, Lawrence. How do you think, what is his posture on this day?
Well, there's no question that today is a political win for the president, and everyone is reading it that way. It's definitely a political win when you see Mitt Romney is forced to go to a microphone and say, okay, here's what I would do about health care. Once Mitt Romney starts talking about pre-existing conditions and all these things, he is in political trouble. However, on the policy side of what happened today, there are some very big losses for the president, which people don't quite realize yet. In fact, in the bill, most, I'm going to repeat this 3 times, most of the increased coverage comes from the Medicaid expansion. The Medicaid expansion is now not enforceable on the states the way the president wanted it to be. The president's version of the Medicaid expansion got only 2 votes on the Supreme Court. Justice Kagan voted against it. Justice Breyer voted against it. They cannot enforce it the way they wanted to. 26 states brought a suit saying we don't want this, and so it is now optional. And by the way, blue states like California, where I am right now, are saying they cannot afford the Medicaid expansion. This state is talking about cutting down the number of school days in order to fund what it has to do in its obligations. But on the tax piece, which is the big news of the day, attentive MSNBC viewers are unsurprised because literally for years I have been explaining to them that the individual mandate is indeed a tax. That is why all of this health care legislation is written in the tax committees. That is why the Social Security law was written in the tax committee. Social Security was justified on exactly the same basis. It is a tax. Medicare is a tax first and a health care program second. That is how these things have always been justified constitutionally. So there really is no surprise there for people who understand the previous use of the power to tax to justify social programs.
Lawrence, if you were saying it, then I doubt it was only a tenth of the MSNBC audience. I'm thinking it's more like 9/10, but I digress. I want to open this up to our panel. John
I'm surprisingly ignorable, it turns out, Alex.
Not true, and we're going to prove that point out on air today.
Right.
John,
Go ahead.
John Podesta, when we talk about sort of the battle to get a national health care plan enacted, your experience obviously as White House Chief of Staff in the Clinton administration, and then certainly your stewardship of the Center for American Progress. It is, I think, in many ways a victory for the idea of health insurance for ordinary, average Americans. To Lawrence's point, though, how much of the plan is in jeopardy? The Medicaid piece was supposed to insure 17 million Americans.
I think he really overstates it, and I'll tell you why. Because I think when states look at that, and in the early period, 100% of the costs are going to be covered by the federal government, and then 80% of the costs are going to be covered by the federal government. Right now, Lawrence notes that in California, particularly because of the recession, but also I think because of some somewhat dysfunctional government out there, they're struggling with their budgets. But I think when states look at what they can provide to their people, and particularly working poor people in this country, which is where that big expansion comes from, people who don't, they're working hard, but they're not being afforded coverage to their jobs. I think governors are going to have to say, we have to do this for our state, and I think most states will accept that money, accept the expansion, and the Supreme Court allowed them to do that.
Michael Steele, we heard from Mitt Romney. We haven't really unpacked his comments yet, but Republicans are doubling down on this. Repeal Obamacare. The branding is still in place. We know that Eric Cantor is scheduled a full repeal in the House on July 11th. It has always been an awkward issue for Mitt Romney, an awkward candidate, but he seems to want to carry it through November. This is, I will repeal Obamacare on day one, it continues to be a main plank of his platform.
Yeah, it is. And I think, he's going to ride that horse very hard because he has to. He's got a base that was excited going back in 2009 and certainly 2010 around this idea against nationalized health care of some form or any form. It's in contradiction, obviously, to the position he had as governor, where he basically implemented a form of that. He's going to have to figure out how to make that argument to independent voters. And while the numbers are with him in the sense that this is still only 30% 37% of the American people really like the idea of Obamacare. That is going to change now. I think the president's going to reframe the argument coming out with his speech in a little bit. I think Lawrence makes a very interesting point. And, Lawrence, you are right.
He's impossible to ignore. His good points are impossible to ignore.
He is impossible to ignore, but he's right about the tax portion of this. Remember, Obama didn't argue this was a tax and avoided, like the Dickens, to the point that this was a tax. But Lawrence is exactly right. This was in the tax committee, and took the Supreme Court to come back and say, now, this is in fact a tax. Now, how the president makes that argument and fashions that argument in an environment where anything related to taxes is problematic.
Well, and to how far can you carry? I mean, the tax argument, how much does that carry water when, sort of the counter to that is, look what you're getting for it?
Well, the obvious counter also is, if this is a tax, then it was a tax in Massachusetts.
Right.
You can't have a tax in one place and not the other. Mitt Romney is going to have a hard time, if the debate is framed over the components of health care. Right. People like, the public opinion against it is more in the abstract, the overall package. But you break it down. As I was walking out the building to come here today, after the decision had been announced, someone stopped me on the street. He said, tears are in my eyes. I have two kids, 22 and 24. One has a pre-existing condition. I didn't know what I was going to do if this was struck down. So if you emphasize that again and again, it puts Mitt Romney in a difficult place, because when it comes to these issues that are very popular, he doesn't have anything to say about them.
Jody, in your magnificent book, The Obamas, which I am 3/4 of the way almost done with, you talk about the struggle internally in the White House around pushing forward on health care, and that, the former chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, said don't do it, but it was really, a personal issue for the president. Tell us a little bit about, so the vindication that he must be feeling at this moment, and sort of what it means in terms of his broader legacy.
Well, you know how people in Washington say all the time, what does President Obama really believe in? I want to know what he really believes in. What he really believes in is giving as many Americans as possible health insurance and reforming what everybody agrees is a pretty dysfunctional system. He made a very difficult choice. He stuck with this legislation many times, even though it looked tough. He paid an enormous political price that he's still paying in many ways. And today he avoided a disaster. I mean, if the alternative had happened, if the court had struck the mandate down, that would have sent a message to swing voters saying the president did something bad, something unconstitutional.
The constitutional law professor did something unconstitutional.
We're going to see him get on TV in a couple of minutes. I agree with David. I think he's going to talk about real people. That's always been what this is about for him. I spoke to Vicki Kennedy a week or two ago about this, and she talked about the president and Ted Kennedy's commitment to just everyday people who were struggling enormously with the system.
I mean, does anyone believe that Mitt Romney has that type of commitment? I mean, he showed it a bit with individual mandates. When he gets out there and talks about these things in the abstract, he doesn't connect. He doesn't identify with the struggles.
The question is also,
he doesn't come up with the solutions.
What is the plan? I mean, it's not going to be a Massachusetts.
That's the problem that House Republicans have too. Repeal. Nothing there.
Well, but there is something there. I mean, you act like for the last 2 years, the House Republicans just sat there and did nothing. There were, in committee after committee, pieces of legislation that touched on, portability and other issues that they put on individual pieces, not this mammoth 2,700-page document. So I think that the Republicans can make a very good argument about how health care can look in the future, without all of this massive government intrusion and build up with the panels that are going to be formed, and the cost
you ran the list
down the road.
Of what is already in law.
Place.
The young people, the 3 million young people who are already getting coverage on their parents' policies. The fact that seniors are in Medicare drug benefit are getting $600 back from the passage of this bill. You go down each and every one. Kids with pre-existing conditions can't be discriminated against. The votes now to repeal are going to be about these real things, not some abstract version of socialism.
Exactly.
And I think it's going to be very tough road
That's
for
true,
the
but the honest part of the conversation still has to center around the cost. Not necessarily right now, but down the road. The taxes that start to come into play beginning next year, $210 billion in new taxes with respect.
if you look at the CBO
if you show me
numbers,
evidence where raising people's
Lawrence,
taxes
I want to bring you in really quickly here. We haven't talked about the dynamics on the Supreme Court, but the president is going to be approaching the podium at any moment. If we can get a question in here, I think we can. We can, because that is not the president in front of the camera. Lawrence, well, one of the things that really surprised me was the fact that it was Justice Roberts who wrote this, who sided with the sort of liberal wing of the court, and not at all Tony Kennedy.
Well, he makes the point that it is the court's obligation to try. We're done.
We are done. President Obama is approaching the podium at the White House, responding to the Supreme Court's ruling. Let's take a listen.